Welcome back to the Godly Impact Podcast. I have a question for you. Have you ever had someone do something very nice for you, but you began to tell yourself a story that their motives really weren't honorable? Well, we're going to be getting very practical. We're going to get down into the nitty-gritty of life today as we are continuing with our series, It's All in Your Head. And this is about the stories we tell ourselves because we tell ourselves dozens, maybe hundreds of stories every single day. And whether it's a micro story that might last for 5 seconds about the person who cuts you off in traffic or the neighbor's dog or about that cousin that you haven't heard from who all of a sudden showed up in your social media feed or whatever. But we also tell ourselves macro stories, and all of these stories, both the micro stories and the macro stories, they have a profound impact in our lives. You see, our stories become our beliefs, and our beliefs become our actions, and our actions become our nature, and our nature becomes our impact. Have you ever had someone who didn't respond to a text or an email or a phone call on your timetable? Well, you start telling yourself a story about why that person hasn't responded. And the pattern of the stories that you tell yourself will say a lot about your expectations of yourself and of others. And the more that you tell yourself a certain type of story, the more you will default to continuing that certain type of story. If most of your stories are like horror stories and everybody's out to get you, well, the more you think like that, the more you will think like that. And eventually what tends to happen, it's not so much that it becomes objective reality, but it becomes our reality, even though it may not have any basis whatsoever in truth. Let's say that your church hosts an event for married couples and your husband doesn't say anything about wanting to go. He doesn't ask if you want to go. You might start telling yourself a story. And it might be a very positive story. It might be, you know what, he's so busy. We're doing really well. And he just thinks this probably isn't the best use of our time and our money right now. That might be a positive story that you're telling yourself. That doesn't necessarily make your story true, but it does make it positive. Or you might start telling yourself a story like this. Well, I guess he doesn't think our marriage is important enough to work on. I mean, he doesn't even think that he needs to ask me, would I like to go? And before long, you can talk yourself into this scenario where it's like he doesn't even care about your marriage and he thinks he's got it all figured out and he doesn't have anything else he needs to work on and blah, blah, blah. I mean, this is why our stories really matter because out of these come our expectations of ourselves and of others. And any time that we start writing a story that we get really attached to, and that can happen super quick, well, confirmation bias loves to come in at that point and just starts adding chapter after chapter to that story with everything else that occurs. You see, the longer that we hold on to a story, the more emotionally invested that we are in it, the harder it is to let it go. Now, I'm a writer. And so as a person of words, I know that the difference between good or even poor and good and okay and great writing is in the editing. And that doesn't just mean my own editing. That means when other people look at it and go, that's confusing. That's weird. I don't know what you were trying to say there. Your sentences are way too long. They're boring, whatever. I mean, if I want to be an excellent writer, I have to not just be okay with that. I have to be intentional to get feedback from other people. Because you see, no one else is ever going to be able to see from everybody else's perspective. Now, we definitely can and should be doing the work to expand our perspectives, but at the end of the day, it is impossible for me to be able to think from every single other perspective there is. And so that's one of the reasons that I do invite other people in to give me really good feedback on my writing. And that doesn't always mean that it's fun and it's easy to get. And it's not always affirming, but it is necessary if my goal is not just to have my writing approved, but if my goal is to have my writing actually be helpful and serve people, then that's part of the process. And in the same way, we have to be willing to let these stories that we write in our minds be edited, be challenged. You know, let's get very practical about this. Maybe you and your spouse have an argument, and a day or two later, he comes home with flowers or chocolates or a pair of fuzzy socks or whatever it is he thinks that you're going to love. And you're going to tell yourself a story about that. And that story might be, oh, isn't that sweet? He's sorry that maybe he didn't handle things well, and he just wants me to feel better, and he wants us to be able to work this out and get back into a good place. And that might be your story. Or your story might be something like this. Well, thinks he can just buy me off with a box of chocolates? Like that's all it's going to take to work this out? He doesn't really want to deal with this serious issue because he just wants it to disappear because he doesn't want to grow up and he doesn't want to have to change and blah, 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 blah. Now, here's the thing. Either of those stories could be true. Maybe he did buy the chocolates because he really does want to be able to work out this conflict, and he wants you to be pleased and to be happy, and he wants you to feel good. And maybe he did buy the chocolates because he just kind of wants the whole thing to go away and disappear. The important thing is, yes, it's important what's true, but that's not our first step, is just to ask. You see, maturity happens when we accept the responsibility to live in the tension between two truths. Now, there's good and there's evil in the world. There is right and there is wrong. And we have to obviously navigate between those things, especially as a Christian in life. But that's not the only tension that we navigate. It's not just between good and bad and right and wrong and all of that. Every truth has a corollary truth to it. And there is a tension that is created between those two truths. Now, one of the characteristics of truth is it never contradicts itself. Never. Everything that is not true, if you take it all the way out to its logical conclusion, will eventually contradict itself. And a lot of times what happens is we just don't walk everything out to its logical conclusion, so we never get to the point where it does contradict itself. But everything that is not true will eventually contradict itself. But truth never does. But what it does do is it creates a tension. If you think of it like two anchors and there's a tightrope that's strung between them. Or if that's a little spooky for you, let's go with a bridge. What holds a bridge together, whatever kind of bridge it is tension. You're never going to have a safe bridge if there's not an appropriate amount of tension in that bridge that keeps it solid, that keeps it together. Whether that is a rope swinging bridge across a canyon or that is a steel bridge across an ocean. It is the tension that makes that bridge work and function like it's supposed to. In the same way, we have truths that we need to learn to navigate and to hold on to so that we can live mature lives. So here's truth number one. We can never fully know someone else's motives behind their behavior. We just can't. The other truth is, we can use common sense and biblical truths to assess someone else's behaviors as being right or wrong, good or bad. And so in between there's the tension of mystery. There's this tension of uncertainty. So we don't throw up our hands and say, well, you know what? We can never know what somebody else's motives are, so I guess we never question behavior. No. If we do that and we let go of this other truth, we're going to end up in a bad spot. It's just going to be a matter of how bad and how frequently and when. But if we let go of the truth that we can never fully know someone else's motives, and we think that, hey, all we need is our common sense and biblical truth, and we're going to be able to determine whether somebody else's behavior is right or wrong, good or bad, and what motivates it, well, then we're going to end up causing harm, because that really moves us into a place of arrogance. So what do? We hold both of these two truths together, and that's how we navigate them. So when we have a story, so let's say, for example, you have a fight with your spouse and your husband comes home with a box of chocolates, okay? We are assuming here that you like chocolate. Now, obviously, if you have a serious allergic reaction to chocolate, like you're going to die, and he comes home with a box of chocolates, that's kind of where it's pretty clear he does not have a good motive. Okay, but we're going to assume that you love chocolate, and so he's going to bring you home a box of chocolates. All right, well, the first thing that you're going to start doing is you're going to start interrogating your story. You don't immediately go to ask, hey, why did you really bring me those chocolates? That is not where you begin. Where you begin is by questioning your own story. Because you see, here's the thing. If you don't develop that skill, eventually the capacity to even consider a different perspective will diminish or even disappear. I cannot emphasize this enough. You have the responsibility to look at your story, and not just to try to support it, but to challenge it, to interrogate it, to put it on trial, to say, is there any other perspective here than the one that I'm telling myself? And most of the time we need to do this when we are telling ourselves negative stories about someone. There are times that we need to do this very same thing when we are telling ourselves positive stories about someone. And that doesn't represent the truth, because as we talked about in a previous episode, the value in all of this, the objective in all of this is not that we turn all of our stories into happy stories, into positive stories that reflect well on people. I mean, we do live in a world where people can be evil, where people can be immature, where people can be destructive, where they can be dangerous, where they can then run the gamut from just being immature to being abusive. And so we're not called to stick our head in the sand and pretend like those things don't exist as Christians. We, of all people, should be most aligned with reality. All right. But at the same time, we also have to develop the skill to say, you know what? There is no way that I can know everything that there is to know. We have our own biases. We have our own perspectives. We have our own experiences that influence how we interpret someone else's language, their behavior, their body language, all of those kinds of things. So we have the responsibility to interrogate our own stories. What other motives could be at work? What evidence is there to prove that my story has holes or is entirely wrong? Romans 12:2 says that we are transformed by the renewing of our mind. We're not going to be changed in our character if we're not changed in our thinking. The two just go hand in hand. You can have a core set of beliefs about God and about Jesus, and to hold to a core doctrine. But if your mind is not in the process of being transformed in these very practical ways, like the stories you tell yourself about your spouse or the kid or, the neighbor or your colleague or whoever, or, that people group across the ocean or that political party in your country or whatever it is, right? We won't be transformed. We might be saved, but we're not going to be transformed into becoming the people that God has designed us and desires us to be. So let's say that you have this story. So let's go back to this example, right? You've had an argument with your husband, and he comes home, a day later, and he's brought you this box of chocolates. And again, you do not have a serious allergy to chocolates. You actually love them. And you have kind of had this story going on. I think he's just trying to buy me off. I think this is his way to just get over this issue, to get past it, because I told him I still needed to talk about this some, and I think he just is hoping that if I have enough chocolate, I'm going to get sidetracked, I'm going to get distracted, and I'm not going to bring it back up again. I think that's what's going on here. And let's say that you really have done the work to interrogate your story, and you're like, I still think this might be the case. Well, then what do? You ask for clarification, but you own the ask, okay? You see, it goes something maybe like this. You sit down and you say, this is the story I'm telling myself. It might be true, it might not be true. I don't know. I want you to know the story I'm telling you, and I really like to hear what you have to say. I think you just brought me those chocolates because you just kind of really want this whole issue to go away, and I'm not ready for it to go away. And then, boop, that's it. This is not the time that you start pulling out all of the evidence you have to support why you think the way that you do. Okay? That is not it. Okay? Now, this is different than saying, you only brought me that chocolate because you're trying to bribe me to be quiet so I don't bring this issue up because you don't want to hear what I have to say because you don't care. Is that right or is that not right? Okay, we're talking about two different things there. So this isn't so much about just the language that you use, although language does matter. I mean, how you approach something does matter. But it's really about the heart that you're bringing to it. Are you coming from a place of humility that says, I'm going to honor my thoughts because I'm going to give them some expression. I do have this concern that I'm just trying to kind of get bribed with a box of chocolates. And I want to make sure that's not what's going on here. But you're not going to move into an interrogation and an accusation that then has to be proved wrong. You see, it's like, I'm going to honor my story enough that I'm going to give it some expression, but my commitment is not to my story. My commitment is to having an accurate understanding, not proving my story. But the second approach comes from a place of defensiveness. And I do understand that a lot of times defensiveness feels like a safer place for us than vulnerability when we have been hurt or when we are very insecure. But even when we've been hurt, even when we're insecure, we can still choose to come from a place of vulnerability, not defensiveness. Because see, a place from defensiveness says, I'm going to accuse you of something. And if you don't want me to believe this, well, then basically it's your job to prove me wrong. You see, in this example, you're not owning the ask. You're putting that pressure off on somebody else to say it's your job to prove me wrong, rather than it's my job to come to you with information, and then I'm going to see what your response is. So if your husband comes back, to that and says, oh, no, I didn't buy you that chocolate. I mean, because I was trying to, bribe you into silence or whatever, I brought it for you because I really do care. And I recognize how important this issue is to you. And I just thought these might make you feel better. I know we haven't solved the issue. And I just don't want it to be the only thing that we focus on right now. Well, at that point, you have a choice. Are you willing to just let your story go? Are you willing to let it be changed and edited? Or maybe even totally thrown out? Because I can tell you as a writer, there are times you can have entire chapters or sections or paragraphs, and you know what? They don't get edited, they get tossed. Okay? So you have a choice in that point. Are you going to believe what has been said and let your story go and write a new one? Or are you going to hang on to that story kind of like, yeah, maybe, I don't know. Now, I do recognize life isn't always this simple, okay? And I'm not saying that just because husband comes back and says, oh, no, I just brought you the chocolate because I thought it'd feel better. And that doesn't make his story true necessarily. But it doesn't mean that you just have to hang on to what you believed with suspicion. You have to look at the whole story of life, not just these individual incidents. At some point in the future, we'll talk about the importance of recognizing patterns. But for right now, most of the time what we're talking about are incidents. They're not part of an ongoing pattern. But again, life doesn't always go the way that it is supposed to. So let's say that you approach husband from a place of humility and you share your story that you think you're just kind of getting bought off with this box of chocolates here. And instead of saying, no, honey, that's not what I'm doing, what he says is, you know what? I just wanted you to have the chocolates because I love you and care about you. And here again, you know what? You are just throwing it back in my face. I can't do anything right. I can never do enough to please you. You know what? I am never buying you chocolates again. Okay. Okay. Well, does that make your story that he's just trying to buy you off true? No. Because you know what? He's been telling himself his own stories over a period of time. And over time, these stories accumulate. And people become more and more attached to their stories. And the confirmation bias becomes real. And eventually people end up like we've talked about with King Saul, where they become convinced that the other person is their enemy when it's not at all the case. It's not even like half the case. It's like 0% truth in that. And that just ends up wasting time and resources and opportunities and joy, because anytime that we are living our lives aligned with a lie rather than aligned with what is true, there is going to be a high cost to that. So I know this is not simple. It's not cut and dry. There's no formula here, but there are principles here to apply. And so the principle of, all right, what do we do when we have a story that we need to find out, okay, is this true or not? And then also, what do we do when we're on the listening end of someone else's story? So maybe it's a matter that your husband, your friend, your kid, whatever has come to you with it and say, you know, I really feel like that you don't really want me in your life anymore. Or I feel like that you're not really happy with the work that I'm doing here. Or, I mean, whatever it is, you know, you can imagine the scenarios that might be present in your life. Okay, so what do? Well, you follow both Stephen Covey's Timeless Advice and Proverbs 15, chapter 15, verse 1. You listen with the intent to understand, not to reply. Have you ever been talking to somebody and it's like you can just tell they weren't really listening because they were trying to understand. They were just waiting for you to get done so then they could say what they wanted to say. That's not how we want to listen when somebody else is sharing their story. We want to listen with the intent to understand, not to just wait for them to shut up so then we can get on with our comments. And then also in Proverbs 15:1, it says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So what can we do? Number one, we listen. We confirm our understanding is correct. We can come back and say, okay, if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is that you felt like I bought you the chocolates because it was my way of trying to distract you so that you wouldn't bring this issue up again. Okay. And if somebody says, yeah, that's exactly right. Okay. Then you have a correct understanding there. Then what you do is this. You see the need behind the story. Because behind every story that we tell ourselves about someone else, there is a question, there is an unmet need. Maybe they need affirmation. Maybe they need safety. Maybe they need security. Maybe they need some clarity or some confidence or some direction. See the need underneath the story. Even if it doesn't get, shared with you in the best sort of way, okay, still see the need and respond with kindness and compassion. As you either affirm or you correct the story, use kindness and compassion. See, there's a big difference, like Proverbs 15:1 tells us, right? If somebody were to come back and say to you, yes, I bought the chocolates only because I just wanted you to feel better. I know that we have this issue to work out, and that's truly why I bought them for you. That's going to be received a whole lot differently than, look, I bought you the chocolates because I just wanted you to feel better. Okay, can we just move on now? Okay. So we want to be able to come and respond from a place of kindness and compassion. So we interrogate our own stories to begin with. Okay, we own the ask then. When we bring that story to somebody else, we don't bring it with a bunch of accusations, shoving the burden of proving us wrong over there. We retain the responsibility to listen, to understand, to ask for clarification. We listen and we respond with openness, with kindness and compassion. And then lastly, and this step is also very important, we allow time for the other person to process. Don't demand immediate acceptance of what you said. Okay. And also don't demand that there is zero frustration from the other person for the story that you brought to the table. Okay, if you sat down and you said to husband, I just feel like you bought these chocolates because, basically you're just trying to bribe me to let go of this matter. Okay, he can genuinely have had a different motive in that, but he might still also have some frustration because that's the story you're telling yourself. Because, let's just face it, it doesn't reflect well on his motives. And maybe he does feel like that he can never do enough to ever provide that sense of safety or security or to show the kindness or compassion that maybe he feels. Okay, so you have to have some allowance that there might be some frustration on the other person's end. Again, okay, it's always great to say, okay, if this situation were reversed, if I was the one hearing this story, how might I feel? But we have to keep kind of a tight parameter on that because then sometimes it's too easy for us to think, well, it wouldn't bother me at all, or, well, I would handle it very differently. And then we start telling ourselves a whole nother line of stories that is not helpful at all. So think about the stories that you're telling yourselves, those micro stories, those macro stories, and then interrogate your story. Try everything you can to punch holes in your story. And then when you do need to own the ask, and that's totally legitimate thing to do. You're never going to get through life without having to do that. I mean, that's part of what we need to do in life. And we are typically far better to do that early in the process than after we have been hanging on to that story for 6 days or 6 weeks or 6 years or whatever. But you all always want to pray and ask for God's wisdom and the Holy Spirit's direction to know how and when and the timing to bring those stories up. Listen with the intent to understand. Identify what's the need behind this story, whether it's mine or it's someone else's. Speak to that need with kindness and with compassion, not with irritation and defensiveness. Own the ask, listen and respond with openness, kindness, and then allow time for the other person to process. All right, my friend, that is going to wrap us up for today. Hey, if you haven't already, visit my website, stephaniepresents.com. There's a weekly newsletter there that you can sign up for by the same name as the podcast, the Godly Impact newsletter that goes out every week. And I also have speaking engagements on there and other resources that you can check out. All right, until next time, keep paying attention to those stories that you're telling yourself because our stories become our beliefs become our actions become our nature, and our nature becomes our impact. I'll see you next time.